Good afternoon and welcome to Leaders in Conversation. This is where we explore more human ways to work with leaders that are challenging the conventional wisdom. We're no longer in the industrial age, but so much of how we think about the nature of work is still stuck in that paradigm. Being human at work is complex, but it's worth the effort because that is the path to a more productive, engaged, and motivated workforce. And so that is our mission here at Leaders in Conversations, to explore these topics. I'm your co-host, Ken Blackwell, and this is my co-host, Amanda Cookson.
Hello, everyone.
Today, we are going to explore the imposter phenomenon with our guest, Terri Simpkin. Terri is Associate Professor and Head of MBA programs at Nottingham University. She undertakes global research into the imposter phenomena and is founder and CEO of Mischief Business Engineering and is author of Braver, Stronger, and Smarter. And she is our guest today. So welcome, Terri, to Leaders in Conversation.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I love talking about this stuff. I have to say, it's really, really interesting.
Brilliant. So I want to say welcome to everybody who's joined us here online today. And what I'd love you to do to get the conversation going is to tell us who you are, where you're from, and as we have a real expert with us today, I'd love you to also put into chat what your questions are for Terri. So there's questions around the imposter phenomenon, please. And while everyone is kind of putting those questions in, Terri, I've got a question for you just to get us started with. So what is the imposter phenomenon? And why is it important that we don't call it a syndrome?
Okay, I'll deal with the second part first. It's never been known as, officially known as a syndrome. The first theorists to actually have a look at this, Pauline Rose-Clance and Suzanne Imes, theorized this way back in the 1970s, and they called it a phenomenon. How it's morphed into a syndrome, I'm not entirely sure, but a syndrome is something that is relatively constant. It's something that's medicalized. It's also, has a bit of a stigma attached to the word, so that it might prevent people from actually talking about their experiences with the imposter phenomenon. So I get a little bit rabid about the whole issue of just don't call it a syndrome. I'm going to get to put it on a t-shirt, it's not a syndrome. Also, I mean, it's easier to say than phenomenon, I have to say. I wonder whether that's part of the reason. But the imposter phenomenon is an experience. It is highly contextual. So a syndrome you would have whether you be at work or at home or in one workplace and another workplace or at university, for example, and it would remain constant again, across all of those contexts. The imposter phenomenon doesn't. You can experience it at university, but not at work, or at work, but not in previous learning or in other areas. You can experience it as a parent, but not at work. So that's what makes it a complex construct to come to grips with, but also why it's not a syndrome.
Mm-hmm. So I'm getting context is really important.
Really important, yeah.
And I try to, in avoiding the word syndrome, because I'm with you on that one, use feelings. So imposter feelings.
Yeah, it could be, you have imposter feelings, you don't have imposter phenomenon. So it's not something that you have or you don't. And again, we might come to this later on in the conversation, but it exists on a continuum. So you can have it in one context, really quite often, and not at all in another. So I mean, that's what the underpinning reason why it's not, but also it's not a medicalized condition. It's not a mental health condition. It's not a disease by any stretch of the imagination. It is a learned thing. It's something that comes from social learning. And because of that, it can be unlearned. Unlike a syndrome, if you experience a syndrome or you have a medical syndrome, it's unlikely that you can learn your way out of it as you can with IP.
Nice.
I was just thinking, if I were this thing we've just been talking about, if I were to personalize it, I might feel that I wasn't worthy to be a syndrome, that, that wasn't I didn't quite
That's a nice
have
way
what
of
it
putting
took
it.
to
Yeah,
be a
yeah,
syndrome, that I was somehow not meeting that, but uh, be that as a way.
yeah.
Uh,
People are thinking I'm a better syndrome than I actually am. Maybe that's.
yes. So let's maybe define first, what are we talking about? So when we say imposter phenomena, imposter
Yeah.
feelings, what are these things which exist on a continuum and can be here, can be there? This
Yeah.
is just to get some clarity around terminology and
Okay.
definition. Let's really
Sure.
define what we're talking about first.
All right, let's pin this down. The original definition that was put together by Pauline Rose Clark, as I said, identifies it as an intense feeling of intellectual phoniness despite successes. And that last part, despite successes, is absolutely key, because we're not talking about people who are pretending to be good at something, who don't have the capability to be doing what they're doing. That is perhaps a true imposter. What we're talking about is somebody who has a whole suite of capabilities, probably an overtly recognized suite of successes and achievements behind them, but they genuinely do not recognize them as their achievements. There's no internalization of that success or of that those capabilities. And again, we're not talking about, fishing for compliments or, oh, I'll get away with you did such a good job because of some sense of humbleness. It is a genuinely held belief that any success or achievement that has come to them has come because of somebody else, something else, such as luck or good fortune, by some mysterious process of osmosis, or indeed somebody's made a terrible mistake and they're just going to get tapped on the shoulder at any moment and saying, terribly sorry, I know that we asked you to take up this job, but we've made a horrible mistake. So people are walking around with that type of sense of fraudulence, even though there is overt evidence to suggest that that's absolutely not the case. And quite often people will experience this underneath a whole front of being outwardly confident and able and somebody who you would expect to be absolutely on their game, but underneath there is this seething, often daily experience of, I'm just waiting for someone to tap me on the shoulder.
So there's a disconnect between experience, right, facts,
Yep.
and the perception of one's value, one's worth, one's performance, right? So
Yeah.
in your research, do you have any insight into what is causing that disconnect between the objective and the subjective personal perception of where they're at?
Yeah. If I could take a step back from where it actually comes from, if I can just identify a number of characteristics and how this actually might play out for people, because it's a learned thing, it's a social construct more than really an individual one. But most of the literature identifies it as something that exists between the ears of the individual, but it actually has a greater impact than that, mainly because of the characteristics. So characteristically, a person experiencing IP would be absolutely fascinated with perfectionism. So not just getting things right, but going above and beyond and setting themselves unrealistically, sometimes impossibly high standards. There is this fear of failure. I have to work hard and polish and polish and polish, because I'm absolutely terrified that if I don't cover all bases and make sure all of the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, that's going to prove to everybody else that I'm not as good as they believe me to be. So there's this fear of failure, but there's also a fear of success. If I succeed at this, everyone's going to think that I'm going to be really good all the time, and I'm going to have this future pressure of living up to my successes. The flip side of that is there's this internalization of failure. So any small setbacks or tiny little mistakes, I should have seen that coming, that's all my fault, even if it's actually not. The other side of that is the externalization of success and feedback. So when the person has polished their project within an inch of its life, it's absolutely perfect, it's out there, and they say, oh, fabulous job you did, that project came in on time, in on budget, it hit all of the key metrics for the customers, well done. Oh, it wasn't me, it was my team. you notice the spelling mistake on page 147? I hope we got away with that. They'll unpick all of the little minor details that didn't quite go right, and they will push away all of that success. And what they're doing, coming back to your original question, is making their internal narrative true. So their internal narrative will often come from childhood. It often comes from, this is a common one that people might resonate with, where you come home with your report card or your end of term marks from school, and there's perhaps a string of A's and a couple of B pluses, and your parents will go, well, what happened here? Congratulations on the A's, but what happened with these B pluses? What are we going to do about these? Or I got 98% on this test. Oh, fabulous! But what happened to the other two? So these narratives start, laying down an expectation that all of the focus is going to be on what I didn't do rather than what I did do. And we drag that type of thing forward into high school, into university, through into our working lives, and it just becomes an underpinning story that we tend not to see anymore because it is so ingrained. And that's just a simple example, but there are other things. It might not necessarily be about intellectual pursuits. It could be, I find myself, from my own experience, born in a very low socioeconomic family in the east end of London, then moved to a council estate in Colchester in Essex. So I had the don't get above your station, if you want to advance your standing, what's wrong with us, aren't we good enough for you anymore type of approach. And of course, all of the stuff around the Essex girl, which people might be aware of, where women from Essex are perceived, and it's actually in the dictionary, that they're unintelligent, promiscuous, of low status, and outwardly vulgar. So you've got these social narratives that are sitting on top of personal narratives, which then you drag into the rest of your interactions with the world, and you're making that story true. But it's very deeply embedded and really quite complex.
And I've got an eye on the chat as you're talking.
It's quite a lot of chat.
Oh, I recognize that narrative. It sounds like you're describing me. One of the questions that someone's put in, which I'm really interested about, because you've been sort of talking about it from an individual level.
Yeah.
But Ellie, so Eleanor Brooks has asked, how does imposter syndrome in a leader impact then on how they behave and interact with their teams?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And as I said, most of the literature and all the research since 1975 has been focused on, and for good reason, what's going on with the individual. How the individual is experiencing it, in what context do people experience this, how can individuals diminish it. And there's very little out there that talks about how this exists in the world and more often in the workplace. So as a leader, and if you are experiencing IP yourself, you are more likely to drag those perfectionist tendencies, not only for yourself, but also for your teams. I've spoken to people from all over the world as part of my research, and some of the conversations have been, now that you say it, I can really see that I've been holding my team to these unreasonably high expectations that I hold for myself. And when invariably I'm disappointed, I'm blaming them for not living up to those standards. So as a leader, you may well be, without intent, holding your teams, your colleagues, your peers, to perhaps even your own managers and leaders, to a much higher standard than is necessary, or for some cases than is actually possible. I've also spoken to leaders who have said, secretly I've taken work away from my teams and redone it. Now, I don't know about you, can you imagine how that team member must have felt? Here is my fabulous work, it's been done to the standards that have been expected, and someone's taken it away and rejigged it to make it look like something that has been polished and polished and polished in an inch of its life, that has gone above and beyond what the requirements are. And of course that pushes people to stress, burnout, and anxiety. And of course, you know, people who experience IP are more likely to experience that overwork, stress, anxiety, depression, you know, maladaptive perfectionism as well.
Yeah, because that's what I was going to ask you, was in a sense, being driven, having high standards, you know, wanting things to be really good. That sounds like all great stuff. So I was going to kind of ask, what's so wrong about this, and how do you know when you are just being a driven, ambitious person, and when is it kind of dipped into this other slightly more maladaptive way of behaving?
Yeah, I think one of the key characteristics is they're not being able to enjoy the outcomes of that. So you're right, getting things done well, having them, you know, exceed expectations to a point is good. If you're a leader, expecting people to expect unrealistic expectations of people obviously is not good. Going above and beyond and expecting everybody else to put in more and more work than is necessary is not necessarily good. What we find with people who experience IP is that even though they put in, you know, lots of work, they're prone to procrastination, then having a last minute intensive, oh, you know, goodness, I'm really going to have to get this done, I have to put in, you know, hours and hours of work. It precedes burnout and stress, but it also, when the results come in, as I said, the feedback is, you know, usually good because we see these people as high achievers, but then they're dismissing all of that praise. So there's no, oh, you know, job well done, aren't I brilliant? You know, I'm relishing in the fact that I've actually done a really good job and other people are telling me that I've you know, smashed it. People with IP will discount it and then move on to the next thing. And all they will essentially have to bear out of that experience is the stress, the procrastination, the anxiety, rather than being able to relish the fact that they're very good at what they do and they are able to internalize the praise that comes with it. So often people have said, well, you know, IP is what makes me good. It's the thing that makes me motivated and that drives me. And my reaction to that is, what you're probably talking about there is a little bit of self-doubt. Self-doubt is really good, but it's not IP. Self-doubt is what pushes you to identify where the gaps in your capability are and to resolve them. Whereas IP consistently sees that there are gaps in your capability and they will never be resolved because you're always externalizing that praise, that feedback, that development. And so for me, there is nothing good about IP because you should be able to enjoy all of that, all of those accolades without the stress and anxiety that usually comes with IP.
So, you know, Amanda, it occurs to me, you know, in the work that we've done in conversational intelligence, that you see, you know, some of the linkages there, right? So the sort of default biological error detection, right, that goes on, what we talk about in terms of, you know, the raised cortisol levels and kind of activating, you know, the more primitive brain, right? And being in that heightened state, right? And how we see that in our coaching practices and as we're working with clients, you know, this kind of backs up. And so there's some biology, right? And so I don't know, Amanda, if you can have an insight there around some of the things that you've been finding in terms of the linkages between what Terry's talking about with imposter phenomena and, you know, some of the coaching work you've done.
Yes, so I think, because I work with quite a few people who struggle with imposter feelings, and I think for me there's a lot of shame, there's a lot of judgment, and these are all things that kind of trigger that kind of threat and get you to kind of flip your lid and not see things quite as they are. So I think that would be kind of helpful to get your view, Terry, about that kind of whole brain view. And then the other thing that I know Ken and I have talked about a lot, which I think is really fascinating, is I've worked in organisations. I work with quite a large group of people across an organisation, and some organisations seem to have a very high percentage of people who struggle with imposter feelings. And I think that's really intriguing about what there is that's going on that gets that gets what I think is like a suspicious number of people who are all feeling the same and all have this same narrative. And I wonder again what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, there's a lot going on in that question. If I can come back to a point that Ken just made around that physical response. This isn't stuff that just exists up here. It exists in the whole body. And the number of people who've suggested to me that when they are having these experiences, and indeed when they're in front of somebody and receiving praise or good feedback, or taking on a report of good work, they get the flight or fight response. There is that stress response that comes with it, and they will have a body language. Oh, it wasn't me, it was my temp. So there's the language that we use in verbal language, there's the body language, and then there is the physiological response to this stuff. And this is the thing that people have told me have driven them to not going for the next promotion, not going to join really interesting projects, because they've gone, I just can't do that anymore. I think I'm just going to sit here and bob along under the radar, where I know that I'm not going to be scrutinized, I'm not going to be held up to judgment, I'm not going to have these physiological and these cognitive responses anymore. So you know what, I'm done. And that's hugely damaging to people's careers, because they see them people coming from behind them and getting jobs, and secretly they're going, I could have done that job. And this is a quote that somebody brought up in the research that I was doing. Said that in my quiet moments, I know I can take on the world. So there's this inner sense of confidence, but I'm terrified that someone is going to call me out for a fake. So in here, there's a level of confidence, and it's a sort of a double whammy of why this is so tragic for people who experience this in an intense way, is that they know they're doing it. So coming back to these responses, they know that they do it, but they can't get out of this cycle. And it is a cyclical thing. Pauline Clance identified how this cycle it just continues round and round. But coming back to your point, there's a myth that this is something that women experience more than men, and that's not true. The social narratives that women contend with, are exposed to, held up against, are different to men, and that's where the difference is. So there's this social narrative, but any point of otherness is likely to underpin a sense of IP. So where you're seeing organisations where there are lots of people who are perhaps feeling this, there is something going on in that community that is putting those people on the outer. So it could be cultural, it could be social. For people who are, see there's a question there in regard to diversity and inclusion, where you are in the minority, so perhaps women on boards, men in midwifery and early childhood teaching, for example, where you're not seeing people like you, where the narrative is it's implausible that someone like you should be doing this job, not it's impossible, not that you shouldn't be there, but it's implausible because you're not seeing people like you, you are more likely to find this IP. And indeed, people that I've spoken to have suggested that they came from one organisation where they were one of many into another organisation where they were one of few, and that's where it kicked in. And they were sort of struck by this sense where they'd never actually experienced it before. So does that sort of underpin you, or make a response to your question? This sense of otherness.
Yeah, and I'm looking at the chat, and people are sort of asking about whether there are specific things that would make a group more likely to have those kind of imposter feelings, and whether there's kind of any link between race, gender, class. I think I'd seen some research about first person in the family to go to university, and things like that, where you're statistically more likely to have
absolutely.
be
Quite a lot. quite a lot of research going on in the higher ed space at the moment, and I'm doing some work across some universities in this area as well, because as you say, there is a policy decision, and quite rightly, to extend the opportunity of university education to underrepresented groups. And what is being found is that once those underrepresented groups actually find themselves at university, they're sitting in a class with people that they believe, and again, it's only plausibility, it's got nothing to do with accuracy or truth or anything that's correct or fact. Plausibility. The plausibility is that I'm sitting in this lecture theatre, having come from a low socioeconomic background, and I'm surrounded by people who have come from privilege. And so people who have perhaps come from privilege have got a sense of a comfort being in this space. They may have been surrounded by family or friends or people that they've known who've gone to university, and so are really quite comfortable with the idea of them going there. It's not an otherness for them. It's part and parcel of their experience, where you find people who've come from, and I know this feeling intimately, you come from a place where no one's ever talked about university, let alone ever gone to university, and then you find yourself at university and you're going, yeah, I don't belong here. And so what we're seeing is those individuals are not only experiencing IP, but IP is preventing them from engaging more broadly in social activities, which again sets up a barrier to them being able to access the same sorts of privileges that their classmates are accessing. And it's very similar for women in non-traditional occupations such as engineering. My global research was pitched at women in the digital infrastructure sector, so data centers, and tellingly, I could find so few women in that sector to do the research on. I extended it out to women in STEM, and they were telling me the same stories. Women going into, just coming out of university, going into their first career, and women who have been through a career and were just about to retire, their stories were essentially the same. I found myself in a position where I didn't see anybody like me, or I expected nobody around me to be like me. And therefore, I was always in a position of questioning my own capabilities. And of course, then you've got the social narratives that exist out in the world that are butting up against that. And so when we come back to the leadership and the workplace context, we're also looking at things like performance management, promotion, recruitment and selection, diversity and inclusion, so EDI initiatives. All of those things can inadvertently fuel that sense of otherness in individuals. So that's where my work is going. So, obviously recognizing that this is an individual thing, but it is also a social thing as well. But yes, any point of difference, there's lots of research on first in family going to university, underrepresented groups in university, so BAME community, quite a lot of work going on in Latina populations in the US, but essentially it's fundamentally the same. It comes back to this point of otherness or perceived otherness.
So you just said very quickly then that there were initiatives that organisations would be doing in their sort of HR departments that are actually going to be kind of fueling and creating more of a problem. And I wonder if you could say more about that.
Sorry, could you repeat that? Because I was just distracted by a question saying, going to need more on the statement, there's no link with gender, please. Can I come back to that gender point? Because there is a link, but it's not a link with IP, it's a link with something else.
Okay.
Sorry, Amanda.
We'll
Can you repeat your question? We'll come back to that.
Do you want to do the gender question first? And then we'll ask about kind of practices that exacerbate IP rather than helping.
Yes. I'll write that down so I don't forget it. The gender piece. Now, I suggested that it is a myth that this is a woman's construct. The original work was done by Pauline Rose-Clance in the 1970s, and it was on her clients who were coming to her. They were invariably high-achieving women. So women who had made it into the corporate space, they were academics, they were women with a track record of success who were presenting saying, You know, I feel like a fraud. I know at any minute someone's going to tap me on the shoulder, I'm going to be found out. And so that's where her inquiry first started. And so this idea that it is something, you know, the preserve of women seems to have sort of, you know, been strung along with that. There is quite a lot of research that is either silent on the fact of gender, or has found very little difference between the way that individuals will respond to IP. So their own, the characteristics of how they're perceiving IP and how they experience it. What I mean by that, women experience it, they don't experience IP differently, but the way that they come to have IP or experience IP in and of itself is driven by social narratives. For example, one of the participants in my research said that she found herself as the only woman in a board. On her first board meeting, she made her way to the floor of the offices where the boardroom was, and she asked, you know, quite as you would, can you tell me where the lavatory is? And the gentleman said, well, there's never been a woman on this floor before, so we don't even know where the female toilets were. Now, coming back to this narrative, it's, you shouldn't be here. No one else has been here. You are the first woman here. So there's this plausibility. It's implausible that I should be here is what's going through her mind. Then somebody came in, handed her his coat and gave her the coffee order. I'm thinking that she was there as a member of the support staff rather than somebody who is his peer. So all of these stories were stacking up against her, making her already the internal narrative that she's already got that she shouldn't be there. All of those stories are, you know, adding an extra layer on top of that narrative. Whereas, and you're speaking to this question in particular, if a man had made it into the boardroom, he probably would never have been faced with that sort of confirmation of that inner narrative. That makes sense. So while IP is experienced by men and women, and the characteristics are very similar between men and women, the external narratives are different, because that's just how gender is constructed in most societies.
I think that's helpful.
It's complex to unpick, but I'm hoping that I've made the distinction there.
Yeah, and I have had, you know, work with clients who are male who do struggle with imposter feeling. So I know it's definitely not exclusive to women, but you're right. You know, if you're in a space and you're being asked to take the coffee order, and you are the only female voice, then that can be really challenging. And the other thing that Ken and I have started exploring is different ways to lead. So if you are leading in a way that's kind of more human, more compassionate, then quite often you can feel othered again and feel like, well, I must be crazy, I must be doing this wrong, you know, blah, 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 because you're the only person who's putting forward a view. And although in your heart you feel like it's right, it's very uncomfortable to be the only one out there with that view.
That's a really good point. And indeed, again, some of the other conversations I've been having as part of my research, where men are saying, look, for many years, it's been expected of me that I'm strong, decisive, almost aggressive, that I've got all the answers and I'm expected to have all the answers. And now I'm in a space where I actually don't have all the answers. And so I'm pretending to have all these answers. And I'm now questioning my own capabilities, because the expectations of leadership now, quite rightly in some cases, is starting to shift to this more human based. And some people have sort of asked me, well, you know, is it you know, because they're men and they're not necessarily in tune with the a feminine way of leadership? I'm saying no, that's just as bad an argument. What we're looking for is humanness. So when the person's, you know, capabilities have been built on something that's quite other than what they're now being asked to do, it could be self-doubt, and they'll fill in the gaps quite happily and go, yeah, all right, I need to do some work and you know, work on that and then come out the other side. That's really healthy. But if it sticks over into imposter phenomenon, then they're going to have all those same characteristics: internalizing failure, externalizing success, perfectionism, self-handicapping. And often the self-handicapping is and there's been a couple of papers on this, not a huge amount, that men are more likely to engage in behavioural self-handicapping, such as substance and alcohol misuse, to set up another excuse as to why they haven't, pursued, promotion or a new job or a new project or whatever, or why they've not done as well on something, because they're setting that up as the fall rather than knowing that it's come from them. So again, that's another one of those areas where we really need to identify the difference between self-doubt and which can be quite healthy, and IP, which is entirely not.
It seems like this is also tied into, like the work that Brene Brown is doing around vulnerability,
Yep.
right? Particularly from the male standpoint, that,
yep.
There are a lot of structures and societal constructs that don't allow for, or certainly don't encourage, male vulnerability. And if you're not allowed to be vulnerable, right, you have to build this up. If you move to a situation where perhaps things lighten up a bit, and you can maybe move around, well, now you have some choices ahead of you, and now you can feel a bit at sea and lost, right? Because, well, now how do I act in this, right? And how did I get here?
Yeah.
It's almost easier to put the blinders on and play the role of someone who is invulnerable and charge ahead, than to be that vulnerable male, in that environment. So
that's right.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and ironically, you end up turning yourself into an imposter.
Well, yes, exactly.
Because you're putting on this front, and keeping that front going is completely draining. So do you want to come back to that comment I made around practices, so performance management and
actually I was hoping we could go there too, and take a look at some of the organizational aspects of this. So if you wanted to dive into how performance management processes can exacerbate IP and those feelings.
I mean, performance management is a bit problematic anyway. Knowing this from my life as an HR director, but one of the conversations that I had really prompted the interest in having a look at it beyond the individual, and essentially it was a person who was suggesting to me that going into performance management was one of her biggest fears. The fight or flight response, putting it off, the writing down what they had done for the previous period, and identifying their own successes, what sort of value they brought to the organisation, was really incredibly difficult for them. And so, I mean, she actually said sitting in an appraisal makes my toes curl. Just thinking about it. She wasn't even in it. She was just talking to me. She was saying, right now my toes are curling, and I've seen people have this bodily response of, I just don't want to go there. So they're pulling themselves in, with this body language, because they have not only exceptional difficulty in internalizing their achievement, it's also difficult for them to actually bring it to those types of meetings. The consequence of that is, if somebody is the appraiser, the manager or the leader is not fully across what that person has actually done, they're not going to get the nuance or a picture of what this person is bringing to the organisation, and therefore may have an impact on promotion, succession planning, pay negotiations. I'll come back to that in a minute. And all the sorts of stuff that relies on an honest, open, transparent and accurate picture of that person's capacities, all that goes out the window. So if the person who's doing the appraisal is not aware, it's going to be detrimental not only to the individual, but also to the organisation, because they're not able to identify where their talent may well be lying. The second thing about the pay negotiation, I had, again, in my research, a very highly competent individual who worked in the finance sector said that it was time for them to go in and negotiate their pay. She walked in, they said, we're offering you X. She said, oh, thanks very much, walked out with X. Person sitting next to her walked in, said, I'm not taking X, I want Y. They said, all right, here, have Y. So this person walked out with £5,000 more in their bonus than what she did. And she said, I knew I was doing it, And you know what's worse? The person across the table knew that I could have asked for more and didn't, and they let me walk out of it. So not only has that person walked away being unsuitably remunerated, but also she now knows that her organisation is in a position to allow her to walk away without an equitable outcome than the person sitting next to her who is doing exactly the same job. Now, that sets up a whole raft of other feelings when you start to think about engagement and trust and all of that other human stuff that comes inside organisations. So highly competent individual has been let down by that pay negotiation, and she's going to walk.
So what I'd love, because I know there are a couple of people who are with us who are in kind of HR roles. So if, and there are a couple of people as well who kind of lead, and they're kind of interested in this from the perspective of, all right, so I want to be a great leader. I want to run a great organization. You've opened my mind to the fact that there may be practices and things that are not helping and that are exasperating this. What do I need to do differently so that I'm not encouraging, fostering these imposter feelings in others?
Firstly, recognize it as an actual thing. This is, there's quite a lot of social media myth out there. There's celebrity X has been diagnosed with the imposter syndrome. That does us no favors when in fact it's been conflated quite a lot with normal self-doubt. So I understand that this is not some fluff that is doing the rounds in social media. As I said, it's got 40 odd years of robust peer-reviewed research into it. So it is an actual thing. But listen out for the language. When you start hearing people pushing back on that, you did a great job with that project. Oh, it wasn't me, it was my team. I just got lucky. Did you notice that spelling mistake on page 147? Oh, anybody could have done that. When you start hearing that language, push back gently. No, that project came in on time, in on budget, absolutely hit all of our clients' requirements, and you led that, so you earned the praise. Don't let people wriggle out of this, because that's, again, it's making their story true. They will become really, really uncomfortable by that, because, that toe curling thing, but don't let it slide, because what people need to hear is evidence-based stuff. You can't wriggle out of evidence-based stuff. If you come up and say, that project was fabulous, no good to anybody, because now that person is walking away going, oh, well, now I have to be fabulous all the time. So you just set me up with some more pressure, but also there's no evidence base to identify what was good about their work. So use evidence-based feedback.
Understand. Is that specific then? Because I'm very
really specific.
Everything's awesome and amazing. So that's not good then. I need to be very specific.
Yeah, and some of this is just good leadership. Being really clear about why you think somebody has done a good job is good for everybody, not just people with who are experiencing IP. The other thing is understand how your systems and processes are riding roughshod or banging up against or fueling inadvertently IP in people. So for example, I hear a lot of people saying, we'd love to get more women into leadership, but there aren't any there. And I put the call out for promotions or other projects and nobody sticks their hand up. What am I to do? Oh, too bad, so sad, we'll just carry on as usual. Go to people where they are. So knowing that people with IP are sitting there looking at the job description or the expression of interest going, got that, oh, I haven't got that. Oh, I'm not quite sure about that. Oh, no, I won't go for it. Whereas they probably do have the capacity to do it. And there's probably evidence that suggests that they do have these capabilities. They just don't have the rear view mirror to see them, and they haven't internalized them. So if you're seeing people who have talent, don't sit and wait for them to stick their hand up. Approach them and say, look, Jane, Fred, Kumar, whoever it might be, there's this role coming up. We think you'd be suitable for the role not because you're fabulous, because you did a stellar job at this other thing, but because you've had this background. The project that you did last time identifies that you've got the talent to be able to do this. We've seen how you've been performing in X, Y, and Z, and we'd really like to see your application. So, people go, oh yeah, well that's, it's not equitable. But the people who don't experience IP will go, yeah, I can do that, and they'll stick their hand up. So you'll get those people, but not necessarily people who've got the capacity and the capability to do more than what they're outwardly showing, you as a leader or the organisation in general. So there are these sorts of things, thinking these things through.
That really resonates with me, because the very first leadership role I applied for, I only did because my boss sat next to me and said, you are applying for this, aren't you? And I was like, no, of course not. Maybe in blah, blah, zillion years time when da, 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 da. And I wouldn't have taken that first step without actually having him sit down and say, you can do this. So that's really helpful. Now, I've been looking again at chat, and there are quite a few people who have said things like, okay, so you said that I can unlearn this. How?
Yeah. Firstly, from your own personal perspective, as well as perhaps leaders and HR managers, is recognizing it as a thing. It is a thing. It is not something that only exists between your ears. I wish I had a penny for every time someone had come to me at the end of my sessions or had engaged with me as part of my research, who said, I thought it was only me. I thought that there was something wrong with me. So to actually have a handle, to give it a name, is the first step. There are a whole raft of tools that you can use. I hate listicles, and you see them all the time on social media. The first one is, write down all your achievements. That's all well and good if you're talking to people who are quite comfortable with writing down and who recognise their own achievements. Very difficult for people who experience IP. So it's about getting uncomfortable with your strengths. It's about having those toe curling moments and moving through them. So being really brutal with self. Actually, somebody told me yesterday in a session I did, they said, God, that was really brutal. But getting brutal with yourself around really understanding where your capabilities and where your success lies, even if it makes your toes curl, and it will, or it will give you that flight or fight response. The more you do that, the less that response will happen over time. Find somebody who has no interest in being nice to you. And I say this for this reason, that people with IP experiences will often dismiss praise or good feedback, even if it's provided to them in an objective manner, because you're just being nice. Oh, you're my friend, you'll always tell me that. Oh, well, you've got an ulterior motive just to keep me on side. Because what IP does, it's asking you to create a validation of your internal narrative. So find somebody who's got no interest in being nice to you and who's going to tell you like it is. You did that project. Again, it came in on time, in on budget. It hit all of our criteria. And that was you. That was down to you. So if the person doesn't have any ulterior motive, then again, it's difficult for that person to wriggle out of it. They go, well, I'm going to have to take this on board, even though it's making my toes curl. So find a mentor, find somebody who is going to not allow you to wriggle out of that praise. Another thing that you won't find in the listicles is find something that you allow yourself to be absolutely woeful at, so that you get used to the idea of not having to be perfect. This is something that worked for me. You won't find this in the literature. This is a personal observation. That I got to the point where I was so tired of having to be perfect that I just wanted something that I could go and do, that I wouldn't be scrutinized for, that I wouldn't have this sense of shame. You talked about Brené Brown's work, that I could allow myself to just be really bad at. So I went and I joined an adult tap dancing class, mainly because I thought, I've got 2 left feet, I've got no sense of rhythm, but you know what, I don't care. I have to get used to not being good at something. And it didn't resolve all of my IP experiences or characteristics, but it helped me to best sit with not having to be good, not having to be perfect, And it didn't matter. It didn't matter whether I was, offbeat or, crashing into my fellow students or falling over on the floor. It allowed me that space to fail. In the workplace, it's difficult to be picking up and doing tap dancing. I understand this. So you might find something else that is, within your area of interest that you can allow yourself to be bad at. But also get to the understanding that failure is part of life. This is sort of, one of those hoary old chestnuts, that we just need to see failure or setback or mistakes as an opportunity to learn. We tell our kids this, we run through this with our students at university, but certainly it's something that we can take on board ourselves. There's a whole raft of other things that you can do, but one of the most profound things you can do is unpick your narratives. Where is this coming from? So if you learnt it from your parents, if you learnt it from school, if you learnt it at university, start to really sit with, where is this coming from? And you really are mindful about this, those conversations will start to crop up. One of the conversations that I recognized from my childhood was my mother, always, I'd come home from school with random facts. I was always into sort of just learning from encyclopedia and picking up random facts. And I'd come home and I'd go, "Mum, did you know that deer eat their antlers?" And she'd go, "Oh, here comes Terri with a useless bit of information." And it was the family thing that when I came up with this insight, I learned about this today. Oh, well, that's not going to be any use to you. It's a useless piece of information. So the underpinning narrative was learning, university, qualifications. It's all a bit useless. Mm. So when I found myself at university, it was, well, I shouldn't be here because of my background. Ironically, my study was into looking at the antecedent to occupational choice, and therefore that took me into the arguments around social class and the differential between people who go to university and who don't. And it sort of struck me like a brick that all of this stuff in my mind was all useless. Therefore, what was I doing it for? I shouldn't be here. And so that's where I was making that story true. So unpick your narratives. Find out where that comes from and start to rewrite your narratives. And so that's where that unlearning, relearning comes from.
Brilliant.
Well, Amanda and I, obviously as coaches, believe in the value of having that other person, to help in the development journey. Yeah. And, as a poster child for, what you're describing a little while ago, the person who would be like, "Oh, no, that's okay," and would put off the compliments. I had I would describe my older colleague as kind in that he had my best interest at heart. He was very firm and direct in how he dealt with me. And he, kind of verbally held me, and as I dismissed a compliment from him, he said, like, "Don't do that." No, he would not let me get away with that. And so, like, basically, Ken, you're dissing me by pushing this off. You're dismissing my compliment. You're invalidating it. You're insulting me. Do you realize you're doing that? And it shocked me a bit to have to step back and go, "Oh yeah, I thought the compliment was about me." And it was only about me. And yeah, there's another person here. And it was a shock to start to drag me out of that. Yeah. And I can think of a couple other folks who, years ago, really kicked me in the behind, figuratively and literally, to help break me out of that. Because it's very hard when you're in it, to see it, right?
Well, you don't see it. And that language, language precedes behavior. And that, if you're saying this stuff to yourself all the time, all you're doing is keeping that narrative alive. You're feeding it. So once, and as you say, it can be quite profoundly confronting to have somebody say, "No, don't do that." Because my experience, with the PhD, that for 5 years I thought my supervisors were just being nice to me, and that they were just waiting for the point at which the external examiner would come in and tell me that I should never have been doing this, and it was a load of rubbish. And so the professors who were guiding me through this work, who've got almost a century of academic experience between them, I was calling them frauds because I was missing their opinion, and 5 years worth of it. That's a really good point. And given that people who experience IP are likely to be others oriented, they'll be people pleasers. But if you say to them, what you're doing is actually dissing me and my compliment to you, you're diminishing my capacity to give you, or my authority, or my insight. You're actually offending me. So when
Exactly.
people with IP realize that, they go, oh yeah, now I see it. Yeah.
And I'm eternally grateful that he was a peer, an older peer, but he took the leadership to do that, right? And I think exactly because of the approach that he used, which was not about Ken but about him, it did hit that people pleasing, other deflecting aspect of me, and it was effective to help start to break me out of that. You still think you can drift into that always, but to be working in that, and so it now has sparked in me a desire to make sure that I can be that help for others. And I think the way in which we can all get out of this, right, is that if we can all help each other, if we can all be those leaders that can be looking out for one another, and helping to raise ourselves up, we all benefit.
Absolutely. And you don't have to do it with a stick. You don't have to beat people over the head with this. You just call it out gently. Because as I said, the person experiencing IP who's using this language, who is showing you this body language, who is genuinely feeling discomfort, that they're going to be confronted by that. So do it gently, and certainly don't go around diagnosing people with imposter syndrome. That would be bad too. Stay away from that.
So I think we got some good tips and some ideas here. As we get closer to our time, is there maybe kind of a singular thought or maybe action step that you'd like to leave our audience with? A call to action here for all of us.
I think primarily understand that it is a much more complex construct than social media would have you believe, and that there, and two, for people who are experiencing it, it is a learned thing. Therefore, it can be unlearned. There are people, even Michelle Obama, who suggested that she experienced imposter syndrome in her terms, that it's just something that you need to live with, that it never goes away. Well, that's actually not true. There are many ways that you can work towards diminishing it, even if, like me, I haven't got rid of it completely, but I can see it coming, and I've developed up some tools to help me deal with that. So it may not necessarily go completely, understanding that it's a contextual thing, but if you see it coming, and I would encourage people to have a look at the work of Pauline Rose Clance, and particularly if you can Google or look at the imposter cycle, because that will map out the thoughts, feelings and behaviors that happen time and time again, and that's what makes it difficult to break out of. That's not one thing, I'm sorry, that's a collection.
That's great. We did have a couple questions in chat, and just to make sure we've got it here, you've mentioned this researcher a couple of times, but I think because you're very familiar with her name, some of us weren't catching it, and some folks on chat want to be clear. So it's Dr. Rose...
Pauline Rose Clance, C-L-A-N-C-E. And her colleague, Suzanne Imes, I-M-E-S. I've actually, a couple of other people have identified it in the chat.
Okay, good.
But Pauline Clance has her own website, and there's a whole raft of materials available, or links to the academic research up until a few years ago, which has not been so active of late. If I can point people in the direction of my website, which is completely not commercial website, is just where I dump my media and musings and blogs and those sorts of things, at forfakesake.org. You won't get spammed. It's all free stuff. You don't even need to log in, but that's there available for people as well.
Great. So for fake sake.
Or I'll put it in the chat. Yeah. So.
Need to make sure you put your teeth in for that one.
There we go.
Brilliant. It's been an absolutely amazing conversation. I think we could have done with another hour, couldn't we, Ken?
Exactly. And I will say I feel worthy of another hour.
There's so much.
Been helpful.
It's quite it's much broader than people believe it to be. So I hope that's given some people a little bit of insight, perhaps to carry on exploring the topic, because it is good for the individual if you're experiencing this to follow it up, but also for people in leadership to understand how this actually works.
Awesome. So
and
Terri, thank you.
Lots of people in chat are saying thank you and just how great it's been.
And if you could, people are wondering perhaps how they might be able to stay in touch. You've got that website. I think that's probably the best place for them to reach out. Yes, great, fantastic.
Yeah.
Been an awesome conversation today. Thank you for joining us. Next week, episode 3 of season 2, and the theme is what is lost by fitting in. We'll be welcoming Veronica Fossa. Veronica is a multi-passionate entrepreneur who has focused her work around the food culture at work. She'll share her experience of what failure taught her about herself, her fear of being an outsider, and the important role of moving on plays in every leader's journey. So you can get tickets via Eventbrite. Look for us on LinkedIn, in our LinkedIn group, Leaders in Conversation, and we will look forward to seeing all of you back for next week's episode and for the wonderful conversation we have every time we're here. So again, Terri, thank you, and we will see you all next week.
Welcome.
Take care.
Pleasure. Bye.